The jellyfish fields were unusually quiet that afternoon. SpongeBob's net swished through the salty air, catching only the faint hum of distant jellyfish. Patrick, as always, was in his own world, humming a tune that made no sense, bobbing in and out of focus as he trailed behind. The sun above Bikini Bottom dipped into a warm orange glow, casting long shadows across the sand dunes. It was the perfect kind of day that made you forget the world could ever be strange or frightening. But fate has a way of turning on a dime. The two friends had spent hours chasing jellyfish without a care, until Patrick suddenly remembered, or claimed he remembered, that there was a carnival in town. SpongeBob's eyes lit up. A carnival meant cotton candy, games, rides, and more importantly, the chance to win a shiny new spatula. The decision was immediate. They packed up their nets, followed the road signs, and hopped on the first bus they saw without so much as checking where it was going. The trip was quiet at first. SpongeBob leaned his head against the cool glass, watching the gentle sway of coral trees and the slow drift of bubble clouds. But as the minutes passed, the scenery began to change. Coral thickets gave way to jagged rock formations. The bright blue water outside the window seemed to deepen, turning into an inky, murky hue. The road sloped downward, steeper and steeper, until the bus seemed to be diving into the ocean floor itself. Patrick didn't notice. He had fallen asleep with his head pressed against the seat in front of him. SpongeBob tried to shake him awake as the bus jolted to a stop. "Patrick, I think this isn't the carnival," he whispered. When the doors hissed open, the air outside was colder. The sound was different, quieter, heavier, as though the water itself pressed in closer here. Strange, angular streetlights illuminated the road, their shapes foreign and unsettling. In the dim light, SpongeBob could just make out the name on the bus stop sign, Rock Bottom. Patrick yawned, stepped off the bus, and before SpongeBob could follow, the doors snapped shut. The bus hissed, turned sharply, and sped away into the darkness, leaving SpongeBob alone. The silence hit him first. Rock Bottom wasn't empty, far from it. Odd-shaped fish milled about in the shadows, their faces sharp, their eyes wide and blinking in a way that made SpongeBob feel like they saw him, but didn't recognize him. They spoke in deep, throaty sounds, each word punctuated by a strange raspberry-like noise from their lips. SpongeBob tried to ask one for help, but his words were met with a puzzled tilt of the head, as if language itself didn't work the same way here. He approached the ticket booth for the bus station, clutching his bag. The attendant was a squat, wide-eyed fish with a slack jaw and an unblinking stare. "When's the next bus back to Bikini Bottom?" SpongeBob asked. The attendant pointed to a sign, "Next bus, tomorrow morning." It was going to be a long night. SpongeBob tried to make himself comfortable on the hard bench. But the strange residents moved differently here, too quickly, darting from shadow to shadow as if time ticked faster for them. Every few minutes, another bus would arrive, but not one was bound for Bikini Bottom. Each time SpongeBob looked up, the street seemed to rearrange itself subtly, lampposts shifting, buildings leaning closer, alleys bending into impossible angles. The smell of kelp snacks drifted in from somewhere down the street, and SpongeBob decided to explore. But Rock Bottom's streets weren't like Bikini Bottom's grid. They curved downward, into narrow trenches that spiraled into blackness. The deeper he went, the stranger the signs became, symbols instead of words, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent shimmer. Then came the sound. It started low, like the rumble of a distant bus engine, but it wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from beneath him. SpongeBob froze, feeling the faint vibration under his square feet. A shadow moved in the darkness of a side alley, long and angular, gliding without sound. For a moment, he thought it was just one of the locals, until it vanished into the ground itself. Back at the bus station, the bench was now occupied by a tall, thin fish with hollow eyes. SpongeBob didn't remember seeing him before. The stranger was silent, but the way he stared made SpongeBob feel as though the fish knew exactly where he'd been, and worse, that he shouldn't have gone there. Hours passed. The strange, flickering streetlights buzzed and dimmed. SpongeBob dozed off, only to be jolted awake by the hiss of bus brakes. It was the last bus of the night. Heart pounding, he grabbed his bag and ran for the doors, but the driver shook his head slowly. "Not your stop," he gurgled, the strange raspberry sound curling around the words. The bus pulled away, leaving SpongeBob alone again. As the silence swallowed the road once more, SpongeBob realized that something here was watching him. Not the locals, something else, something that didn't live in the open streets. The shadows seemed thicker now, curling like smoke in the corners of his vision, and somewhere in the distance, that low rumble started again. The night in Rock Bottom wasn't like nights in Bikini Bottom. Back home, darkness came with the comfort of soft coral lights, the gentle bobbing of jellyfish, and the faint sound of bubbles drifting lazily upward. But here, the darkness was different. It felt heavy, pressing close against SpongeBob's spongy form, as if the water itself wanted to smother the light and sound before they could travel too far. He sat on the cold, uneven bench outside the bus station, trying to focus on the one familiar thing in sight, the street lamp across the road. Its light didn't shine steadily. Instead, it pulsed, dimmed, and brightened again, almost like it was breathing. Each flicker threw strange, angular shadows across the jagged pavement, making the streets seem alive. Rock Bottom was quieter now. The strange, deep-throated chatter of its odd-shaped locals had dwindled to the occasional muffled voice drifting from some hidden street. Every so often, SpongeBob heard the faint slap-slap of footsteps on wet stone, quick, deliberate, and never close enough to see the source. He hugged his bag closer, telling himself the same thing he'd been repeating since the bus left without him. Just wait until morning. Just wait until morning. But waiting wasn't easy. The silence wasn't restful. It was the kind that pressed in around your thoughts and filled the space between your heartbeats. Every few minutes, he swore the shadows were longer than they'd been before. Then came the rumble. At first, it was so soft that he thought it might just be another bus in the distance. But it wasn't coming from the road. No, it was coming from beneath him. SpongeBob looked down at the cracked pavement beneath the bench. For a split second, he thought he saw something shift in the darkness between the stones, a ripple of shadow, sliding as though it had its own current. He blinked, and it was gone. He told himself it was his imagination, but his eyes kept darting to the edges of the street, searching for movement. That's when he saw it. A narrow alley, just beyond the station. SpongeBob was almost sure it hadn't been there before. It was a thin, jagged gap between two crooked buildings, so narrow that a normal fish might have to turn sideways to slip through. The far end glowed faintly with a soft, blue-green phosphorescence, the same strange hue he'd seen earlier on the spiral street signs deeper in the city. He swallowed hard. A smarter SpongeBob might have stayed put, but he had never been good at resisting something mysterious. He glanced at the ticket booth, empty now, and clutching his bag, stepped toward the alley. The instant he crossed its threshold, the city's noise died. The distant footsteps, the low murmur of voices, even the soft hum of the street lamps, gone. The only sound was the faint swish of his own steps. The walls on either side seemed higher than they had from the outside, and they leaned toward each other in a way that felt intentional, like they were watching him pass. The water here was colder, the temperature dropping with each cautious step. That glow at the far end pulsed slowly, almost in time with his own nervous heartbeat. SpongeBob tried to gauge the distance, but no matter how far he walked, the end didn't seem to get any closer. He turned around, expecting to see the bus station, but behind him was only more alley, stretching back into the same blue-green glow. He froze. "Okay," he said aloud, because hearing his own voice was better than the silence. "That's weird, but I can just turn around again and head back." But when he turned again, the glow ahead suddenly brightened, and something moved in front of it. At first it was just a silhouette, tall and angular. It didn't walk. It drifted, slowly, deliberately. SpongeBob squinted, trying to make out its features, but there were none. No face, no fins, no eyes. Just a shape that seemed almost too thin to be real. It tilted its head in his direction. SpongeBob took a step back. The figure didn't make a sound, but the water around it seemed to warp, like heat rising from a grill. Then, without warning, it moved, fast. One moment it was yards away, the next it was halfway down the alley. SpongeBob's whole body went rigid, and then he heard it again. The rumble, louder this time, shaking the ground beneath his feet. It seemed to be moving in rhythm with the figure. Panic surged. SpongeBob spun and ran. His square pants slapped against the stone, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. The glow ahead blurred into streaks as he sprinted toward it. The rumble followed, vibrating up through his legs, until it felt like the whole alley was alive. He didn't dare look back. When he finally burst through the glow, it was like breaking through a wall of cold water into somewhere entirely new. The sound returned all at once. The distant hum of the city, the faint buzz of street lamps, the dripping of water from some unseen pipe. But this street wasn't the one he'd left behind. The buildings here were older, their stone dark with age. They leaned toward each other in ways that made the narrow streets feel like corridors. Faint streams of silt drifted down from cracks in the walls, catching the lamplight like falling dust. There were locals here, but not many, and they were different. Each one wore long strips of kelp draped over their heads, hiding their features entirely. They moved slowly, deliberately, never speaking. None of them looked at him. None of them even acknowledged his presence. From somewhere below, far below, came a sound. Not the rumble this time, but a thump. Slow, rhythmic, like something knocking against the underside of the city. SpongeBob turned, desperate to find the alley again, but it was gone. Where he expected the opening to be, there was only a solid wall of jagged rock. He stepped backward, heart hammering. Somewhere deep down, beyond the streets and the strange locals, something in rock bottom was awake, and it knew he was here. SpongeBob stayed rooted in place, staring at the wall where the alley had been. The jagged rock was damp, glistening faintly under the flickering lamplight, but there was no sign of an opening. He ran his hands along its cold surface, pressing, pushing, but it was solid. He stepped back again, feeling the weight of the street settle over him. The kelp-draped locals still shuffled slowly along, their long green strips swaying slightly in the current. They didn't look his way. They didn't speak. They seemed almost like sleepwalkers, moving to some silent rhythm only they could hear. The slow thump from beneath the ground came again. This time, SpongeBob felt it in his chest. He swallowed hard and decided to move, if only to get away from the oppressive stillness of this street. The buildings were taller here, their upper windows dark, their walls carved with deep grooves that might have once been patterns or warnings. The lampposts were fewer and farther apart, casting more shadow than light. He rounded a corner and froze. One of the kelp-draped figures was standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. Unlike the others, this one was facing him directly. The strands of kelp hung over its face like a curtain, but SpongeBob could feel its gaze through them. "Hi there," SpongeBob tried, forcing a wavering smile. "Could you, tell me the way to the bus station?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one slow, deliberate hand and pointed to a narrow side street. The gesture was stiff, almost mechanical. Thanks?" SpongeBob said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. He took a few cautious steps toward the street. The figure didn't move. The side street was darker than the main road, but it wasn't empty. A faint glow came from an open doorway halfway down. SpongeBob hesitated at the threshold. The door itself was tall and warped, its wood swollen from years of moisture. Strange symbols, the same spirals and jagged lines he'd seen before, were etched into its surface. Inside, the glow came from a single round lantern hanging from the ceiling. The room was small, lined with shelves holding jars of things SpongeBob couldn't identify. Behind a low counter stood another kelp-draped figure, though this one's kelp veil was tied back slightly, revealing a sliver of a face, sharp, angular features, and eyes that were far too dark. "You're not from here," the figure said in a voice low and deliberate, with a faint rasp at the end of each word. SpongeBob flinched. No. I'm just waiting for the morning bus. Got stuck here by accident." The figure tilted its head, studying him. "No one is here by accident." The words landed like a weight in SpongeBob's stomach. "Well, I really am. I was just..." The figure raised a hand to silence him. "It has been moving since you arrived." "What has?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they turned to one of the shelves, selecting a small, round jar filled with a thick, cloudy liquid. Inside floated something that looked disturbingly like a fragment of shell, etched with tiny lines. The figure set it on the counter. "You have heard it," they said. SpongeBob's voice wavered. The thumping? The figure nodded. It is older than rock bottom, older than the water above. It sleeps most of the time. But sometimes, the thump came again, faint but undeniable, as though the city itself was confirming the story. Sometimes it remembers. SpongeBob blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Remembers what? The figure leaned in slightly, the kelp brushing against the counter. The way out. A chill rippled through him. You mean, it's trying to leave? The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took the jar and pushed it toward him. If you want the bus, you will need to find the Veil Gate, but it does not open while it moves. The Veil Gate? It is the only way out when the streets begin to shift. You will know it when you see it. But be careful, the movement wakes other things too. SpongeBob's fingers hovered over the jar, not sure whether to take it. Why give me this? The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. It will see you before you see it. The jar will hide you. Once. Do not waste it. SpongeBob looked down at the jar. The cloudy liquid swirled faintly, as if stirred by something unseen. When he looked back up, the figure was gone. The kelp veil still hung behind the counter, but there was no one wearing it. The lantern above flickered. The thump came again, louder now. SpongeBob backed out of the shop, clutching the jar. The street outside was different. The buildings were closer together, and the lampposts had shifted places. The kelp-draped locals were gone. The silence was deeper. He turned in a slow circle, searching for the street he'd come from. But it wasn't there anymore. Only a long, narrow stretch of road sloping downward into darkness. Somewhere far ahead. In that darkness, a pale light flickered. Not the warm glow of a street lamp, but something colder. SpongeBob's grip on the jar tightened. The Veil Gate was somewhere in this city, and whatever was moving beneath it was getting closer. The pale light ahead pulsed faintly, almost in time with the deep thump beneath the streets. SpongeBob hesitated at the top of the downward sloping road, clutching the cloudy jar the kelp-draped shopkeeper had given him. The glass felt colder now, the liquid inside swirling without being shaken. The slope was steeper than it looked. SpongeBob's square shoes slipped on the slick stone as he descended. The tall buildings on either side leaned inward, blocking most of the faint overhead light, creating the sensation of walking into a tunnel rather than a street. With each step, the air, or rather, the water, grew colder. The silence deepened. The occasional rumble from before was gone now, replaced by that slow, deliberate thump that seemed to resonate in his chest. SpongeBob tried to focus on the pale light ahead, but as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a lamp at all. It was something flat, embedded in the ground, a perfect circle glowing with a bluish-white light. Around its rim were the same spiral and jagged line carvings he'd seen on the shop door earlier. The carvings weren't etched into the stone, though. They seemed to float just above it, shimmering faintly as if they were being projected from somewhere below. He stepped closer. The thump grew louder. The circle was about twice his height in diameter. Its surface wasn't solid, not exactly. The light inside it rippled faintly, like the surface of water viewed from beneath. There was something about it that made him shiver, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the water inside the circle seemed deeper than the street it sat on. He could see no bottom, only darkness that swallowed the light as it descended. SpongeBob crouched near the edge, trying to see more clearly, and nearly jumped out of his square pants when the surface shifted. A shadow moved beneath it. It was quick, darting across the light like a fish in shallow water, but the shape wasn't right. Long, thin, and it bent in ways that made his brain try to reject it. The shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. This must be the Veil Gate, SpongeBob whispered to himself, recalling the kelp-draped figure's warning. But how was he supposed to use it? The shopkeeper hadn't told him how it worked. All they'd said was that it wouldn't open while it moved, and from the way the thump was growing louder, whatever it was wide awake. The sound built until it was almost unbearable, rattling the jars and nearby windows, shaking tiny stones loose from the cracked buildings. SpongeBob stumbled backward, afraid the street itself might split open. The Veil Gate's pale light flared bright, then dimmed so suddenly it seemed to swallow itself. The surface of the gate rippled again. This time, the shadow beneath it didn't dart away. It rose, slowly, impossibly, A shape began to form beneath the light. At first it looked like a cluster of jagged rocks, but as it neared the surface, SpongeBob realized they were teeth. Massive, uneven, and sharp, they formed the edge of a mouth far larger than the gate itself should have been able to hold. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the water, not from the gate, but from inside SpongeBob's skull, like a voice speaking directly into his thoughts. Not yet. SpongeBob stumbled back further, clutching the jar to his chest. Not yet? Not yet for what? The water in the circle swirled violently, the light bending and warping. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the motion stopped. The teeth sank back into the darkness, vanishing completely. The pale light returned to its faint, steady glow. SpongeBob's breaths came fast and shallow. He took a step toward the gate again, but the moment his foot crossed the ring of carvings, every shadow in the street shifted. They didn't move with the light. They moved on their own, curling toward him like reaching fingers. A deep voice rasped behind him. "It saw you." SpongeBob spun around. Another kelp-draped figure stood in the street, this one taller than the others. The strips of kelp hung almost to the ground, swaying in a way that didn't match the movement of the water. "What do you mean?" SpongeBob stammered. The figure's head tilted slightly. "You went too close. Now it will remember your shape." "What is it?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and began walking away. After a few steps, it paused and looked back, the kelp veil parting just enough for SpongeBob to see a single, pale eye. "If you want to leave, you must hide in the still streets until the moving stops." "The still streets?" SpongeBob repeated. "Follow the lamps that do not flicker." Before he could ask another question, the figure turned a corner and was gone. SpongeBob looked down at the jar in his hands. The cloudy liquid inside swirled faintly, as though responding to the presence of the gate. The shopkeeper's words echoed in his mind. "It will hide you, once. Do not waste it." A sound came from the gate. Not the thump, not the rumble, patted. Something else. A slow, deliberate scrape, like stone dragging against stone. SpongeBob turned and ran. The road sloped upward now, but the buildings seemed to stretch taller as he moved, blocking out more of the faint light. His eyes darted to each street lamp he passed. Some flickered, some didn't. The figure's warning rang in his ears. "Follow the lamps that do not flicker." At the next intersection, SpongeBob stopped. Two roads stretched ahead, one bathed in steady light, the other in unsteady, pulsing glow. Behind him, the scrape came again, louder, closer. He chose the steady light. The deeper he went, the quieter the city became. No locals, no rumbling, no thump. The buildings here looked older still, their surfaces worn smooth, their doors sealed shut with what looked like hardened coral. The street lamps cast a constant, unwavering glow. And yet, the silence here wasn't comforting. It was absolute. No current stirred the silt on the ground. No distant clinks or hums carried from unseen alleys. It felt like the city was holding its breath. SpongeBob slowed his pace. Every sound he made, the faint slap of his feet, the creak of his bag, seemed too loud. He almost wished for the distant thump again, just to prove the world was still moving. Then, up ahead, he saw it. The black stone arch loomed over SpongeBob like the entrance to another world. The word "still," carved into its top, seemed almost to hum in the water, though no actual sound came from it. He hesitated at the threshold, one foot hovering just short of crossing over. The air, or rather, the water, was different here, denser. The faint current that had been pushing gently against his side for hours was gone. His SquarePants clung oddly to his frame, the way they did in a pool with no circulation. He took a breath he didn't need and stepped through. The moment his foot crossed under the arch, the silence deepened. It wasn't just that there were no sounds, it was the absence of movement entirely. The particles of silt that had been drifting lazily in the water before were perfectly still now, frozen mid-suspension as though time had simply stopped. SpongeBob glanced up. Even the faint, flickering glow of the distant bioluminescent plankton was motionless. The lamps here burned steadily, casting unbroken cones of light that didn't waver or dim. "This is weird," SpongeBob whispered. His voice felt wrong here, like the sound had nowhere to go. bouncing right back into his ears. The buildings were different, too. They were smoother, the jagged carvings of the rest of rock bottom replaced by long, unbroken walls of dark stone. No doors, no windows. Just flat, seamless facades stretching into the shadows. SpongeBob took a cautious step forward. The ground beneath his feet was smoother as well, almost polished. His reflection looked up at him from the damp surface, and then, for a moment, didn't move with him. He froze. The reflection's eyes blinked a half-second later than his own. Then it smiled. SpongeBob stumbled backward, and the reflection instantly returned to normal, matching his movements perfectly again. He stared at it for a long moment, waiting for it to do something else, but it only mirrored him. "Okay," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "Nope, nothing creepy going on here at all." The thump he'd been hearing for so long was gone now, but in its absence, he felt an even heavier weight, like something here was holding that sound back. He walked on, following the row of steady lamps deeper into the still streets. There were no locals here, no kelp-draped figures. The only movement came from him, and even that seemed muffled, dulled somehow. Then he saw it. At the far end of the street, barely visible in the dim light, was another figure. It wasn't draped in kelp, it wasn't shaped like any fish he'd seen in rock bottom. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head brushing the underside of an overhead archway. Its arms, or what looked like arms, hung down almost to the ground. It wasn't moving. SpongeBob took a step closer. The figure didn't react. Another step, still nothing. He could make out more of it now. Its surface was wrong, like a statue carved from coral that had been left to grow wild for centuries. He inched forward, telling himself it was just that, a statue. And then it tilted its head. The movement was slow, deliberate, and silent. The head turned just far enough for SpongeBob to see the faint suggestion of a face, eyes sunk too deep, mouth too wide. He backed up a step. The figure didn't move again. Trying not to look at it, SpongeBob turned down a side path between two buildings. The lamps here were closer together, their light overlapping in a continuous strip. It made him feel a little safer, until he realized there was no end to this path. He walked for what felt like minutes. The lamps kept coming, one after another, identical and evenly spaced, but the street never turned, never opened into anything else. The jar in his hands, the cloudy one the shopkeeper had given him, grew colder. The swirling inside slowed until it, too, was perfectly still. Then, from behind him, came a sound. It was faint, like the pop of a distant bubble, but in the absolute silence of the still streets, it was deafening. SpongeBob turned slowly. Halfway down the path, the tall, thin figure stood in the light. Its head was tilted the other way now, and it was closer than before. He clutched the jar tighter and began to walk backward. The figure didn't move, or at least, he didn't see it move, but with each blink, it was closer. His heart pounded, though the sound of it seemed muffled even to him. The path ahead of him suddenly split. One branch led left, into a stretch where the lamp's glow faded quickly into shadow. The other led right, toward a faint, shimmering archway that looked nothing like the black stone one he'd entered through. The shimmering seemed to pulse, faintly, like a thin curtain of light. "The Veil Gate," SpongeBob whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was the same one. He glanced back. The figure was only a few lamps away now. SpongeBob bolted for the shimmering archway. His steps felt heavier here, each one harder to take, like the water itself was trying to hold him back. The arch grew brighter the closer he got, until he was bathed in its cold glow. Behind him, the figure stepped into the last pool of lamplight. It lifted one long arm and pointed directly at the jar in his hands. SpongeBob didn't stop to think. He dove through the archway. The world moved again. The sudden rush of current almost knocked him over. Sound came flooding back. The faint hum of lamps, the distant chatter of rock bottom's locals, even the far-off thump beneath the streets. He gasped, realizing only now how suffocating the stillness had been. But when he looked down, the jar was no longer cloudy. The liquid inside was clear now, empty of whatever had swirled within it before. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in his head. "It will hide you." Once. He was out of the still streets. But something else had come with him. SpongeBob stumbled out from the shimmering archway and into a narrow back street. The water here moved again, swirling faintly around his square form, but it didn't feel like the same water as before. It felt thicker. He took a moment to catch his breath, staring at the jar in his hands. The cloudy liquid was gone, replaced by a clear, empty fluid that swayed gently in the current. The kelp-draped shopkeeper's words came back like a whisper in his mind. It will hide you, once. The fact that the jar had used itself meant only one thing. Something had been looking for him, and it had been close enough to see. SpongeBob looked back at the archway he'd passed through, hoping, foolishly, to see only empty street. Instead, he saw the lamps in the distance flicker one by one, as if something tall was walking past them. The movement was slow, deliberate, but constant. He gripped the jar tighter and turned away. The street ahead twisted between leaning buildings, their shapes more chaotic here than in the still streets. The carved grooves in the stone walls returned, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to change slightly when he wasn't looking at them. Faint voices murmured somewhere far off, not close enough to make out words, but enough to remind him he wasn't entirely alone. The thump from beneath the city had returned, too. It was softer here, but steady, like the beat of some massive heart. SpongeBob found himself stepping in time with it without meaning to. He rounded a corner and froze. One of the kelp-draped locals stood in the middle of the road, motionless. Their head was bowed, the long green strands swaying slightly in the current. As SpongeBob stepped closer, they slowly lifted their head, the kelp parting just enough for him to see their face. It wasn't the same shopkeeper from before, but their eyes had that same deep, endless darkness. "You came back," they said in a voice low and even. SpongeBob hesitated. Yeah, but I'm not staying. I just need to find the bus station." The figure tilted their head slightly. "It saw you." He swallowed hard. "I know. You can't outrun it now. Not here, not in the moving streets." SpongeBob's voice cracked. "Then how do I get away?" The figure stepped closer. "Find the hollow market. The gate there is always open, for a price." Before SpongeBob could ask what they meant, the kelp strands fell back over their face and they walked away, vanishing between two buildings as if the space had swallowed them. He was alone again. The thump grew louder, and then, faintly, another sound joined it. A slow scrape, like stone on stone. SpongeBob's skin prickled. He didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The shape from the still streets had found him. He ran. The streets twisted unpredictably, bending in ways that didn't match the city's layout he'd seen before. He passed alleys that seemed to loop back into themselves, doorways that led to walls, stairways that went down but never ended. The scrape followed, always just far enough behind that he never saw the figure directly, but the shadows told him it was there. Once, he risked a glance over his shoulder. Far down the street, in the unbroken light of a lamp, the tall shape stood perfectly still. SpongeBob's pace quickened. He could hear his own breaths now, the sound loud and uneven in his ears. He kept his eyes ahead, searching for any sign of the hollow market. Then, finally, he saw movement that wasn't the shape. An open plaza stretched out before him, ringed by stalls and carts piled high with strange goods, glowing coral shards, jars of black sand, shells with holes that whistled faintly in the current. The locals here were busier, moving in strange, stuttering motions, their kelp veils rustling as they exchanged quiet words in their throaty language. SpongeBob stepped into the plaza, the scrape behind him vanishing the moment he crossed into the space. It was as if the market itself had a boundary the shape couldn't pass. A figure at one of the stalls turned toward him. This one's kelp was tied back to reveal a smooth, pale face, marked with faint spiral carvings around the eyes. "You're looking for the gate," they said before SpongeBob could speak. He nodded quickly. "Yes, the one that's always open. Please, I just want to get home." The figure studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the far side of the market. "It's there, but the price must be paid before you cross." SpongeBob's voice wavered. "What's the price?" The figure's dark eyes didn't blink. "It must take something that will make you remember." SpongeBob frowned. "Take what?" The figure's lips curved into a faint, unsettling smile. "You'll know when it chooses." He didn't like the sound of that. But the thought of staying here, with the shape waiting just outside the market, was worse. He moved through the crowd, the locals parting silently to let him pass. At the edge of the plaza, an archway of coral rose from the ground. Inside it shimmered the same strange light he'd seen at the Veil Gate, only this one pulsed more rapidly, as if it were eager for someone to pass through. SpongeBob stepped closer. The water around the arch felt electric, every pore in his spongy body tingling. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard it, the scrape. It was faint, but growing louder. The market's boundary wasn't holding it back anymore. SpongeBob turned toward the gate, his mind made up. Whatever the price was, he'd pay it. As he stepped under the coral arch, the water around him shifted, and something unseen reached into his thoughts. He felt a pull, deep and strange, like a memory being plucked from the back of his mind. He gasped as an image slipped away from him, one of his clearest, happiest memories of home, jellyfishing with Patrick in Jellyfish Fields. The details blurred. The sun, the colors, the sound of Patrick's laughter, all of it washed away, leaving only the faint knowledge that it had happened once. The gate's light flared, and SpongeBob stepped through. The gate's light flared so brightly that SpongeBob had to squeeze his eyes shut. When he opened them, the cold shimmer was gone. He stood in a street that looked normal, almost too normal. The buildings here were shaped like the ones back in Bikini Bottom, neat, rounded edges with tidy doorways and small, square windows. The signs above the doors were in proper, readable text, rather than spirals or jagged symbols. The lamps glowed steadily. Even the water temperature felt warmer. For a moment, SpongeBob thought the gate had actually worked, that he'd made it home. But then he noticed the silence. There were no jellyfish drifting lazily overhead, no distant murmur of conversations, not even the hum of a bus engine. And the street smiled. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he looked closer, he saw the pattern of cracks in the stone, long curves and short lines that, together, formed a broad, crooked grin stretching across the road. It wasn't drawn or painted, it was part of the stone itself. The more he stared at it, the more he felt like it was staring back. SpongeBob took a careful step forward. The smile didn't move, but he swore the curve deepened slightly, as if pleased by his approach. "This is fine," SpongeBob muttered to himself, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Streets can't smile. Streets don't even have faces." Somewhere far behind him, the gate gave a faint shimmer, and then winked out of existence entirely. He was trapped here now. SpongeBob pressed on, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could tell him where he was. The buildings were all lit from within, but their windows were covered from the inside, blocking any view. He tried knocking on one door, but it didn't sound like knocking on wood or coral. It sounded hollow. No one answered. He turned down another street and froze. At the far end stood one of Rock Bottom's locals, 2PS, but not draped in kelp. This one had bare, pale skin, its head slightly too narrow, its eyes wide and dark. It was smiling, too. The same broad, crooked grin as the street. SpongeBob waved nervously. Hi there. I think I'm a little lost." The figure didn't respond. Its grin didn't falter. SpongeBob took a step toward it, but before he could speak again, the figure tilted its head sharply to the side. Not like a curious motion, more like the snapping of a rope. Then, without moving its legs, it slid forward an inch. SpongeBob backed up. Nope, 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 nope. The grin on its face widened. He turned and bolted in the opposite direction. The buildings seemed to lean closer as he ran, their shadows stretching across the road to try and catch him. The cracks in the street twisted, forming new curves and lines that bent into more smiling faces. He turned another corner and found himself back at the same smiling figure. It hadn't moved from its spot, yet it was here now, blocking the road ahead. Its head tilted the other way this time, and that crooked grin seemed impossibly wide. The thump from beneath the city returned, vibrating through his feet. The figure's grin widened again, if that was even possible. SpongeBob's grip on the empty jar tightened. He didn't know what it could do now that it had lost its hiding power, but holding it made him feel less defenseless. Then he remembered the shopkeeper's other warning. You will know the gate when you see it. He scanned the streets, looking for any sign of light, any flicker that didn't belong. And there, between two shadowed buildings, he saw it. A faint glow, smaller than the other gates, but still pulsing faintly. He darted toward it. The smiling figure didn't follow. Instead, every crack in the street seemed to shift, the grin spreading wider and wider until it spanned the entire road. SpongeBob's feet slapped against the stone, each step feeling like it landed on something that could swallow him whole at any moment. The glow ahead grew brighter. He could see now that it wasn't an archway, it was a door. A small, rounded door set into the base of a building, the light spilling from the gap beneath it. SpongeBob reached for the handle, but before he could pull it open, a shadow passed over him. The smiling figure was behind him, close enough now that he could hear the faint sound of its lips stretching. SpongeBob yanked the door open and dove inside. He tumbled into darkness. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the faint light from the street. For a long moment, all he could hear was his own breathing, fast, uneven, and too loud. Then a voice came from the darkness. "You're not supposed to be here." It was deep, slow, and didn't sound like any of the locals. SpongeBob froze. "And who exactly are you?" The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, something lit up. Not a lamp, not a torch, but a faintly glowing set of spirals carved into the wall. When the voice finally spoke again, it rumbled through the room. "I am the one who remembers what rock bottom was before the streets began to move." The spirals on the wall glowed faintly, their light spilling across the small, enclosed space. The walls were rough and uneven, but they weren't made of stone. They felt more like hardened coral, layered over time. SpongeBob's eyes darted around the room, but he saw no one, only the glowing spirals, shifting subtly as though they were breathing. "Where are you?" he asked. The deep voice came again, reverberating through the walls themselves. "Everywhere in this room. You stand in my memory." SpongeBob tilted his head. "Your memory? This place is older than your city," the voice said. "Older than the streets, older than the lights, older than the buses that brought you here. Rock Bottom was not always like this." The spirals brightened for a moment, and SpongeBob swore he saw shapes moving within them, glimpses of an older Rock Bottom. The buildings were smaller, simpler. There were no spirals carved into the streets, no looming shadows. The water seemed lighter. "It was once a station," the voice continued, "a crossing point between the shallows and the deep. Travelers came and went, and the ground beneath was still." SpongeBob stepped closer to the wall, drawn to the images. "So what happened?" The streets began to move. The spirals shifted again, the images within them darkening. Buildings twisted into unnatural shapes. The roads bent and looped back into themselves. The locals' faces changed, their eyes growing darker. "No one knows how it began," the voice said. "Some say it was the deep current shifting. Others speak of something older, something that woke beneath the city." SpongeBob swallowed. "The thumping?" "Yes," the voice rumbled. "That is its heartbeat." The spirals flared brighter, and now SpongeBob saw a new image. The Veil Gate, glowing just as he had seen it. But beneath it, in the darkness, something vast moved. Only parts of it were visible. A long, sinuous body, ridged and scaled, with teeth like jagged coral. "It sleeps most of the time," the voice continued, "but its dreams are heavy. They press against the city, bending its streets, twisting its paths. When it stirs, the still streets appear, and the watchers wake." SpongeBob's brow furrowed. "The tall thing, from the still streets? They are not alive as you understand it. They are the shadows of its gaze, shaped into forms that can follow." SpongeBob shivered. "So, the smiling street?" A pause. "The smiles mark the places it favors. To walk there is to be seen." He took a step back from the wall. "Okay, well, I just want to get home. How do I leave without it? You know, seeing me again?" The spirals dimmed slightly. "There are only two ways. One, wait until it sleeps again. This could take days or years." SpongeBob gulped. "And the other? Pass through the deep gate. But it lies in the hollow below, where the ground is not solid. The hollow below? The voice deepened, the water vibrating faintly. Beneath the lowest streets, beneath even the still streets, there, the current runs in circles, and the walls are made of its bones. SpongeBob hesitated. That sounds, dangerous. It is, but if you find the deep gate, you will return to your home. If you fail, you will join the city's movement forever. SpongeBob didn't like the way that last part sounded. The spirals dimmed further, their glow now only faintly illuminating the room. There is a passage in the smiling street. It leads downward. Follow it until you see no more lamps. Then listen. Listen for what? You will know, the voice said. The spirals faded completely, plunging the room into darkness. SpongeBob waited for the voice to speak again, but the silence stretched on. When he finally turned toward the door, it was already open, the faint light of the smiling street spilling inside. He stepped out. The street's wide, crooked grin was still there, cracks in the stone curving upward in that too familiar shape. But now, at the far end, a section of the road had shifted. A narrow opening gaped where two buildings leaned apart, leading downward into shadows so deep his eyes couldn't follow them. Behind him, the smiling figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. SpongeBob clutched the empty jar tighter and took his first step into the dark. The street's grin seemed to widen. The narrow passage sloped downward sharply, the stone under SpongeBob's feet slick with algae. The deeper he went, the more the city above seemed to vanish, not just in sight, but in sound. The faint hum of street lamps faded. Even the distant thump that had haunted him for so long seemed quieter here, as though he were slipping beneath its rhythm. The walls pressed close on either side, forcing him to turn sideways in places. The only light came from faint, pale streaks in the stone, 200 mineral veins that glimmered dimly, leading him deeper. After a while, he noticed the water's temperature dropping again. The cold here wasn't like the crisp chill of the still streets. This was heavier, a cold that seemed to sink into him, weighing down his limbs. His square pants clung tighter to his body, and the water felt thicker with each step. He reached a point where the path widened, just enough for him to stand straight again. The ground here was different, soft, almost spongy underfoot. At first he thought it might be silt, but when he pressed his toe into it, the material gave way with an unsettling spring. It wasn't stone. It wasn't sand. It was bone. He froze, staring at the pale surface beneath him. Massive, rib-like curves rose on either side of the path, vanishing into the dark water above. The mineral veins he had been following seemed to grow directly from these bones, casting their faint glow like the veins of some ancient, sleeping creature. "This is fine," SpongeBob whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "Just a totally normal road made of giant bones." The thump returned, louder now, not faint or distant, but close enough to feel in his chest. And then he heard it, a low, drawn-out groan that seemed to come from all around him. The bones under his feet vibrated with the sound, sending shivers through his entire body. He pressed forward. The rib-like walls slowly curved inward, forming a tunnel of bone. The mineral glow grew brighter as he went, illuminating the strange carvings scratched into the surface. They weren't the spirals of the streets above. These were long, jagged lines, intersecting in chaotic patterns. Some of them were fresh. Something had been here recently. SpongeBob's pace quickened. He could feel the tunnel descending further still, the pressure of the water increasing. The thump kept perfect time with his steps, like the city's heartbeat was matching his own. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast, domed chamber. The ceiling was lost in darkness, but the floor glowed faintly, covered in the same pale bone. In the center of the chamber stood the deep gate. It was unlike the other gates he had seen. This one wasn't made of stone or coral. It was carved entirely from the same bone as the chamber, its arch lined with sharp, tooth-like ridges. The space within the arch shimmered faintly, but not with the pale blue light of the Veil Gate. This glow was deeper, darker, like the color of the ocean at its most lightless depths. SpongeBob took a cautious step toward it. Something moved in the water to his left. He spun, scanning the shadows, but nothing was there. The faint mineral glow played tricks on the edges of his vision, shapes rising and vanishing before he could focus on them. Then came the scrape. It was the same sound he had heard in the still streets, slow and deliberate. The tall shape had followed him here. SpongeBob's grip on the empty jar tightened. The shopkeeper's words rang in his ears. "It will hide you, once." That chance was gone. The scrape drew closer, but this time it was joined by another sound. Deep, wet, dragging noise, as if something massive was shifting across the bone floor. From the shadows at the edge of the chamber, something began to emerge. At first it was only an outline, distorted by the faint glow. Then the details became clear. Massive, jagged teeth. A long, ridged body that seemed to fade into the darkness above. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, but deep, spiraling voids that pulled at his gaze. It wasn't the tall figure. It was the thing beneath rock bottom. The thump was deafening now, reverberating through the chamber. The creature's spiraling eyes fixed on him, and the tall figure appeared beside it, like a shadow stepping free from the wall. SpongeBob's breath caught. The gate was only a few steps away, but his legs felt frozen. The voice from the spiral room echoed in his mind. "If you fail, you will join the city's movement forever." The tall figure took a step toward him. The creature's spirals began to glow. SpongeBob forced himself to move. 1 step, 2. The gate's glow intensified. The creature shifted, its long body coiling slowly, as though preparing to strike. SpongeBob reached the arch and felt the cold, dark shimmer wrap around him. For a split second, he thought he saw home through the darkness, the faint outline of the Krusty Krab in the distance. And then something grabbed his arm. The cold grip around SpongeBob's arm was not like any touch he'd felt before. It wasn't just strength, it was as though something was wrapped around his very thoughts, pulling not only at his body, but at the idea of himself. He looked down. The tall figure from the still streets had its long, angular hand clamped around him. Up close, it didn't look like flesh, or stone, or even kelp. Its surface rippled faintly, like the reflection of a shadow on moving water, but the water here was still. It shouldn't have been able to ripple. The massive creature behind it loomed like a mountain in the dark, its spiraling eyes blazing brighter now, casting shifting patterns across the bone floor. The thump had become so loud it was no longer a sound, it was a force, pressing into him, rattling the air in his lungs and the liquid in his pores. SpongeBob tried to pull free, but the figure's grip didn't loosen. It didn't even feel like something he could break. It felt like trying to pry himself out of his own shadow. His other hand clutched the empty jar the shopkeeper had given him, the glass slick from the cold. He knew it was useless now, and yet he held it anyway. "I'm not staying here," he shouted, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the dense water of the hollow below. His voice came back to him muffled, like it belonged to someone else. The figure tilted its head slowly, the motion almost curious. Then, still holding his arm, it began to step backward toward the creature, and SpongeBob was dragged with it. The spirals in the creature's eyes began to spin faster. The movement was hypnotic, pulling at his vision until the rest of the chamber blurred and faded. For a moment, it felt like the floor had tilted sideways. The water's current began to twist unnaturally, not around objects, but through them. Images flashed in the spirals, the shifting streets above, the silent kelp-draped locals, the crooked smile of the road. They flickered in and out like memories being shuffled through by unseen hands. And then a voice, deep and slow, echoed in his head. Not the spiral keeper's voice, but something older. "Stay." SpongeBob's knees wavered. The command felt heavy, like the weight of the whole city pressing him down. The tall figure's grip tightened, pulling him one step closer to the arch of the creature's mouth. Between the jagged teeth, he saw not darkness, but a faint glow, the same pale shimmer as the veil gates, only this one pulsed with a rhythm that matched the thump. The voice from the spiral room returned faintly, almost too far away to hear. "If it takes you, you will walk until the streets move no more." The tall figure's other hand began to rise toward SpongeBob's head. He knew, instinctively, that if it touched him there, something would be taken, something he could never get back. His grip on the jar tightened until the glass creaked. He didn't have time to think about whether it would work. He swung it upward with all his strength. The jar shattered against the figure's arm. releasing the last traces of the cloudy liquid into the water. It didn't spread like normal liquid. It curled and twisted in sharp spirals, clinging to the figure's surface like frost. The figure froze, its head tilting slightly as though confused. SpongeBob wrenched his arm free and ran. The deep gate loomed just ahead, carved from the massive bones of whatever creature had once filled this chamber. The ridged edges felt like teeth, and stepping between them felt wrong, like willingly stepping into a mouth. But behind him, the tall figure was already moving again, the spirals of frost melting away from its arm. SpongeBob dove into the shimmer. The cold hit him instantly, a crushing, endless cold that gripped every part of him. He couldn't tell if he was swimming or falling. The darkness pressed in from all sides, turning every movement into a struggle. The shimmer behind him was gone. A moment of terror hit him. What if the gate didn't work? What if this was just another trick? Another street disguised as freedom? Then, ahead, a pinprick of light appeared. It grew slowly, then faster, until it engulfed him. The crushing cold loosened, replaced by the warm, familiar water of the shallows. He tumbled forward, sprawling onto smooth pavement. Blinking against the sudden light, he sat up. The air smelled different, fresher, lighter. Above him, the sky was a calm blue. Jellyfish drifted lazily overhead, their movements slow and peaceful. He knew this place. The bus stop sign stood right in front of him, exactly as it should be. The timetable read, "Next bus, any minute now." SpongeBob let out a shaky laugh, glancing down the familiar street. Everything looked normal. No crooked grins in the pavement, no flickering lamps, no kelp-draped locals staring without blinking. The bus rolled up within moments. The driver, a round fish with a warm smile, gave him a nod. "Rough day?" he asked casually. "You could say that," SpongeBob replied, climbing aboard. He settled into a seat near the back, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the window. As the bus moved, the sights of Bikini Bottom rolled by: coral houses, small kelp gardens, the distant outline of the Krusty Krab. For the first time in what felt like days, he began to relax. Then, as the bus passed the edge of a quiet street, he saw it. Far away, just at the boundary where the buildings met the open water, stood a tall, thin silhouette. Its head tilted slightly as the bus rolled past. SpongeBob blinked hard. When he opened his eyes, the silhouette was gone. The bus turned down another road, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again, until they crossed a small patch of cracked pavement. The pattern curved upward in the faint suggestion of a smile. SpongeBob sat back in his seat, the comfort of home now tinged with a creeping unease. The streets of Bikini Bottom didn't move, but somewhere far below, Rock Bottom still remembered him. And maybe, just maybe, it was smiling.